But before I get into the guts of the presentation, who is PSI? So, Public Services International is a global union federation. We represent 20 million public sector and public service workers who are members of over 700 affiliated unions across 163 countries. So in Australia, the affiliates for PSI include the ASU, ETU, HSU, New South Wales Nurses and Midwives, the CPSU, and of course the CPSU SPSF. So that's why I'm here today, because of a link to your state union. What we do is we act to promote and protect quality public services. We work through union solidarity to build a better world. And I'm going to give some examples about how we do that in just a minute. But I was just, I was struck by watching that footage on the workers in Burma and the dedication of those trade union workers there. And you look at the abject poverty that workers, not only in Myanmar, but around the world are living in. And you think about the conditions that we're in and you think, well, we've got it pretty lucky. But I think when you take a closer look at what's happening in countries like Australia, developed countries around the world, I think we've got to change that view that we're lucky. A little bit about me. I grew up in the Blue Mountains. Grew up in the 1970s in the Blue Mountains. I was born in a public hospital. When I went to primary school, it was a public primary school. I went to a public high school up there. My dad worked at the power station, the public power station out at Wallerawang, and my mum, when she was working, worked at the public hospital where I was born. I was lucky enough to go to university, and I was especially lucky enough because I'm a registered nurse, I'm a registered midwife. I was the last year to go through fee-free. The year after me started paying HECS. So I had free tertiary education. And then when I started working, I worked in the public sector hospitals in Nepean, Bride, RPA, a range of them. And I walked into a workplace where I had long service leave, penalty rates, I worked an 8-hour shift, I had job security. I'm a product of the public sector, and I can't believe how lucky I am to have gone through life having that support. But that's not the world that I'm handing on to my 14-year-old son. That's not the world I'm handing on to my 14-year-old son. Housing is unaffordable. Education is becoming unaffordable. You used to be able to go to TAFE to become an enrolled nurse, get supported through that course, work your way, become an RN, and you could see how working through the public sector provisions, you could improve your life. Now it costs $30,000 to become an enrolled nurse. People aren't developing anymore because of that. And we look at healthcare and the amount of co-pays that we have to pay now. Going to a doctor is becoming unaffordable for people. Getting treatment is unaffordable for people. In fact, 1 in 8 people are missing their care in Australia because of cost alone. We grew up in a different time. Inequality is growing. The CEOs in this country earn 78 times more than you and I. 78 times more than you and I. So how do we understand this world that we're living in? How did we get from a place where social democracy was delivering free healthcare, a social security safety net that worked, supported housing, community services, and free tertiary education? How did we get to this? The change has its roots in the 1970s. Thatcher and Reagan embraced the theory of free market and small government, the belief in the invisible hand of the free market. This might be unpopular, but in Australia too, Hawke and Keating embarked on privatisation and deregulation. Australia is the 3rd highest privatising country in the world. Top 3, consistently there, China and us. We are seeing austerity in Australia, cutting of funding of services, running them down and selling them off, or simply just cutting them out. And deregulation is allowing businesses to do as they please. The Adani coal mine is going ahead despite the fact that we're burning the earth, despite the fact that the Indigenous people have said no. We're getting asbestos imports into this country. And you just need, on a global level, to look at the Greenfield Towers to know that free marketeers are getting their own way. The other 3 dot points on there, privatisation, low to no taxes and free trade agreement, I want to spend a little bit more time on. So Public Services International, along with its Australian affiliates, a couple of years ago called the People's Inquiry into Privatisation. We sought an independent panellist. We got David Hetherington from Per Capita. We got Archie Law, who was working for Action Aid Australia at the time, and we got Yvonne Henderson, who was a former Human Rights Commissioner, I think I've got that right, from Western Australia. And we toured the country, and unions like yours came and gave presentations about the impact of privatisation on our communities. So we heard the stories about the tapes. We heard the stories about 7 hospitals that had been privatised in this country that had failed and had to be brought back under state control. We heard about the 175 people that got a hospital-acquired infection in Western Australia because of privatised cleaning services. We heard about how privatised electricity system in Victoria has seen prices go through the roof and was directly attributable to the deaths of some of the people that died in the recent bushfires there. And we heard from your union about the impact of privatisation of disability services. There was one presentation from a mother. She was talking about her fear about her daughter's care under a privatised system. I think she had a big impact on the inquiry panel, because she said to them, the only thing I can hope now is that my daughter dies before I do, because she was so concerned about the care and who would look after her, who would advocate for her in the absence of the public system. And I think you ought to be congratulated on the pressure that your union has consistently placed on Labor and on the Liberals in this state, but especially on Labor, to stand up. And a fantastic announcement yesterday by Luke Foley to say that if a Labor government is elected, they will maintain state provision of disability services. You're to be congratulated on that pressure. One of the important things that I want to point out, right, is that when you look at public services and you look at the way that we benefit a community, you start to understand the interconnectedness of everything. So a couple of years ago, you remember there was the big fear of the Zika virus coming out of Brazil. Does everyone remember that? When you think about how Zika virus is able to move across so quickly and how we protect ourselves from Zika virus, people start thinking about, well, it's a virus, we've got to think about the healthcare system. But the virus came from mosquitoes, and mosquitoes breed in still water, they're collecting in waste. So we need a good cleaning service. We need education for people about how to protect themselves from mosquito bites. We need personal protective equipment so that workers can go out there and deal with the rubbish and cleaning that up. So you can see that it's not just about one particular part of a public service that's important. It's about the interconnectedness of public services that make them work. Except we've got governments that are slowly tearing them apart. So we can see that privatisation is bad. I want to talk quickly about tax avoidance. I understand you had some workers here yesterday talking about their massive strike down in Victoria. So I'm not going to go on to I won't talk much about the Exxon tax avoidance. But when people often think about tax avoidance, they think about Apple, they think about Google, and they think about big companies like that. Research a few years ago looked at who pays tax in this country. They looked at the ASX 200. So the top 200 companies on our stock exchange. And what they found is that tax avoidance is rife. In fact, there's this company run by this fella, you may not have heard of him, Rupert Murdoch, right? And he owns this company called 21st Century Fox, the Telegraph, little company. Their estimated tax that they pay off profits in this country is less than 1%. We've got a federal government that wants to drop the tax rate from 30% to 25% when these bastards are only paying 1%. Sorry for the language. That's $1.6 billion that were missing from our public services across this country. People might not have heard of this company called Chevron. It's Chevron Australia. What they did was they've got this big gas export extraction plant up off the northwest shelf of Western Australia. Chevron Australia, they're a poor company. They couldn't afford to build the things that they needed to extract the gas from our seabed. So they had to borrow all of their money from this company called Chevron in Delaware. So they've got this massive loan to rip all of the gas off the seafloor, our seafloor, for which they pay no royalties. But their loan repayments are so high that they make no profit whatsoever. So guess what? Chevron pays no tax in Australia. They get our gas for free, they export so much of it we don't have enough of it in this country, and we get no tax from it. We will soon be the highest exporting country of liquid natural gas in the world. Qatar, who is the second highest, reaps more from their tax system than we do. And when you think about why do we have privatisation, when you think about why do we have tax avoidance, when you think about why do we have austerity, if it's all so bad, why aren't our governments doing something about it? It's because the free trade agreements they're signing us up to lock them into it. Free trade agreements are bad for public sector workers, and I'm going to quickly go through why that's so. In free trade agreements like the TPP, like the RCEP agreement, and like the Trading Services Agreement, three big trade agreements you need to find out more about. They have very similar clauses in them. One lot of clauses forces more deregulation. It's called a standstill and ratchet clause. So once we've signed up to this free trade agreement, governments, whether it's local government, state government or national governments, cannot change the regulatory system in their country if it's going to affect that private company. So, my background is nurses union. One of the things they're fighting for is nurse-to-patient ratios in the public hospitals and in the aged care system. Hopefully you've seen their ads. If we're lucky and we get the government to commit to ratios in aged care and they put it in law, if we don't get that done before these free trade agreements are signed off, and remember the TPP is before our parliament now, if we don't get that done before the TPP agreement is done, that legislation will become onerous to the private people that run the aged care system in New South Wales, in this country. So in other words, enforcing that regulation will be against the free trade agreement, which means companies like Bupa will then sue the Australian government for loss of profit. So when we want to do things, when we as public sector workers want to make changes to improve things for our communities, these trade agreements will block us from doing that. We've got to go to more deregulation. We can't go for more regulation. Politicians will say to you, free trade agreements, public sector services are exempt. They will say that. But the definition of a public service in these free trade agreements is one where the service is provided neither in... I'll start again. If a service is provided in both the public and private sectors, it is not considered a public service that is protected under these trade agreements. So in Australia, do we have a public and private healthcare system? Do we have a public and private school system? There are not many public services that are not offered in both the public, that aren't offered in the public and private sphere, right? So, what the trade agreements say is that where a service is offered in both the public and private sphere, they must be increasingly open to the private sector. It is these free trade agreements that is driving privatisation. They'll also further restrict government procurement. So when purchasing or tendering for services, multinationals cannot receive unfair treatment. They have to be treated just like the public sector here in New South Wales. There was an example, you would have seen in the news recently, where up in the northern part of this state, northern New South Wales, a local hospital had a contract with a local milk supplier called Norco. Is there anyone here from up that area? Okay. So Norco was providing the milk to the local hospitals up there. The hospital said, well, we're going to cut the contract, and the workers up there said, no way, local jobs are good, support local industry, keep Norco in the hospitals. And they won that fight. Under the free trade agreements, that will be illegal. The multinationals must be given equal access. So you get stupid things. When we finally get the disability services back under, some disability services back under state provision, if you were forced to tender to do that against a private company, even if you own the land currently, the government currently owns the land, they have to pretend like they don't. So they have to put the value of the land that they currently own into their tender, because otherwise it's unfair on the multinationals like Bupa. The other big threat for us as public sector workers is specialist migrant workforces. Under the free trade agreements, if a private company comes and sets up here, so they come and set up a service in New South Wales, they can apply to be exempt so that they can bring in their own workforce. They don't have to do the market testing to see if there's workers available in Australia already. And when you look at the global impact that has, I was in the Solomon Islands recently, and they're being flooded with workers from overseas. So you think this is just an Australian thing, it's not, it's a global thing. So I was talking to the unions in the Solomon Islands and saying, so are these specialist workers, are they taking the hospital jobs, are they taking the clerical jobs in government? No, they're the people serving you behind the counter at the grocery store. They're the person serving you your drink. This is how stupid a specialist worker can be. They couldn't find someone with the skills in the Solomon Islands to serve you a drink. Investorstate dispute settlements in free trade agreements is what solidifies it all. Do you remember a little while ago, Philip Morris tried to sue Australia for bringing plain packaging cigarettes in? It cost us $50 million, we think. They won't tell us how much, but we estimate $50 million just to defend ourselves against that case. And we didn't win it on a question of law. We won it on a technicality. Because when Labor brought in the plain packaging for cigarettes, Philip Morris looked for a free trade agreement where it could sue us. And it realised that we had a free trade agreement with Hong Kong. So they restructured their entire business structure here in Asia Pacific so that they were then located in Hong Kong, and then they tried to sue us. And it was that late move, the technicality there, that meant that their case got kicked out. But these courts where these cases are heard are not like the courts that you and I know. They don't follow natural justice. The judges sitting hearing these cases are the lawyers that negotiate the free trade agreements into being in the first place. On one day, an Australian will be heading the hearing. On the next day, they'll be putting a case against another country. And there's no precedent. So the fact that we won that against Philip Morris doesn't prevent them from coming back and trying it again somewhere else in another country. So this means that governments get very scared in changing policy, particularly developing countries around the world. We're lucky, we come from a rich country. 50 million, that's nothing to the federal government, right? But imagine that for a country like Myanmar. When they want to look at cutting down the incidence of smoking in their country by introducing plain packaging cigarettes, they're going to get sued by Philip Morris. They won't afford the $50 million. So again, if austerity, deregulation, privatisation and low taxes are the hallmarks of neoliberalism, it's these free trade agreements that drive them, that forces them to comply. We've got to look at how they all work together. We can't fund quality public social services without tax justice, and we can't fight deregulation and procurement rules without fighting free trade agreements. We can't leave anyone behind, and we need a sustainable planet. But to do this, we need to fight neoliberalism, and that's what PSI does. We fight neoliberalism on a global level, and we do that through working with unions like yours. We know neoliberalism is failing us. You just need to remember that video you watched just now. I wouldn't have bothered with this slide had I known such a great video was going to be shown. But again, think about this in a developed country. Look at the UK. The UK had the once great National Health Service, where healthcare was free. It's been privatised, it's been broken up. Governments are cutting social services. The British government, the UK government is cutting social services and cutting social security. And the outcome of that is that in London, one of the richest cities in the richest nation in the world, kids have rickets. Kids have rickets because of malnutrition. The system simply isn't working. In the USA, the Rust Belt across America is leaching into the rest of their country as the middle class disappears. And here in Australia, a growing number of retirees are facing homelessness because they can't find anywhere affordable to rent. Indigenous people in our country have health outcomes that are comparable to third world countries. Public services are the path to sustainable development. History tells us that, and there's growing evidence that that's true. So PSI recently worked with the World Health Organization and the United Nations, doing some research and lobbying and arguing the case, and we looked at health workforce investment. And what that found is that if a country, public sector, gets one doctor to set up a clinic, that creates 4 jobs. Every doctor position you create creates 4 jobs. So government investment in healthcare is an investment in the community. It's how you stimulate the economy. Employing people like you means that money is going into communities. Typically public sector workers, up until recently, we had secure jobs. We had long-term jobs. That's changing. And because of all of that, people are looking for answers. And in the absence of a strong left, workers are drifting to the right. The fascists are coming out of the woodwork, make no mistake about that. There were racist right-wing rallies here in Sydney and Melbourne last year. And late last year, 60,000 fascists marched in Warsaw, Poland. And if you know your history, you know how shocking that is. But popularism is not just a US thing. There's Duterte in the Philippines, there's Modi in India, Brexit, and our own Pauline Hanson here. This is all evidence, some argue, that neoliberalism is devouring itself, that the free market is removing a key component that it needs for its own survival. The workers who can purchase the products that they want to make in their free market. We're seeing lower wages, insecure work and growing rates of exploitation, wage theft, even here in Australia. At the same time, the social safety nets are being removed. We're living in a moment of time that's going to determine generations to come. There's an urgent need for us to act and for unions to offer the alternative. I mentioned the inquiry that we did before. The report from that, Taking Back Control, came out and made a number of recommendations. The first one of which was that we call for a moratorium on privatisation until greater regulatory mechanisms and proper policy frameworks are implemented around the delivery of public services. And when you go on to read the report, it's available on the website there. You can check it out on Facebook. I'll ask you to like that Facebook site, People's Inquiry into Privatisation. The way those recommendations are set out means that no private company is going to agree to it. They're not going to agree to the transparency that's required. They're not going to agree to the accountability that's required. And they're not going to agree to maintaining workers' pay and conditions, because that's how they make a profit when they privatise. Also, unions are fighting and winning. Again, the Nurses and Midwives Union, they just fought, along with HSU and ASMOV, just stopped the privatisation of 5 public hospitals in New South Wales. And again, your great win recently, now all you've got to do is make sure that you hold Luke Foley accountable when he gets elected. Let's hope it's a when. PSI also works to spread those wins. So we take those stories. Recently, hospital in Fiji is up for privatisation. So we're going to be in there helping them, showing them how the Australian unions fought so that they too can protect their public hospitals. There's a global trend taking place where public services are being taken back under control, remunicipalisation. Across Europe and across Asia, communities are taking back control of their public services, and that's a trend we need to follow here. PSI is also working to take the tax avoiders head on. Just recently there was a report released which looked at the tax avoidance practices of aged care providers, private for-profit aged care providers. So again, Bupa. Bupa has given millions of dollars of our taxpayers' money to provide quality aged care. And yet aged care workers are some of the lowest paid workers in this country. And you've all seen the reports recently about the abuse and neglect that's occurring in these aged care facilities. They're things that we should not stand for and the things that we're not standing for. We're shining a light on their poor behaviour and holding them accountable. But more importantly, we're saying to the politicians, you've got to change the laws that allow them to get away with this. You've got to change the international tax laws that allow them to hide their millions in the Cayman Islands while people are starving on these streets. So there are global drivers of change. There's the free trade agreements, the recessive tax laws, and the right-wing populists. But we can choose an alternative. There was a report here by Per Capita in Australia that showed that people want more services, not tax cuts. Across Australia, people would rather pay more taxes and get good, decent public services than they would have those extra few dollars in their pockets. The ACTU put out a report that shows that people believe in unions and that most people would join a union if they were asked. Another report recently indicated that people want socialist politics. People want socialist policies in their life, like free education, free healthcare and social services. And we're seeing that around the world there is a mood for change. Corbyn and Sanders are examples of that, and I think that our very own Sally McManus is starting to take up that mantle. But we have to be careful that we don't get caught up in the cult of the personality. This is my running gag, so apologies to the few of you that have heard this already. But when you look at Corbyn and Sanders, if it was about an old white guy with a beard up on a stage winning the revolution, it's not, right? It's not about people like me, it's about people like you, it's about people like your co-workers, it's about people like your family and your community. We need a social movement that pushes these politicians to take those stands. We've got to be vocal about public services and about public sector unions being the answer, because they are the answer to a sustainable development, and we should be proud of that. We should demand free healthcare as a human right, demand free education as a human right, demand affordable housing, equal pay and equity as human rights. Demand your union rights, demand our human rights, and demand that people come before profit. Public sector unions must lead the way. We must be the drivers of global change through the solidarity between individuals, between the solidarity between individual unions, and between the solidarity on a global level. So I ask you, who will raise their voice? If not you, then who? And if not now, then we've missed the chance of a lifetime. Thank you very much.